In a world where success is often measured by power and prestige, Aidan Blackwood's story is a reminder that true change begins with one individual who dares to challenge the status quo. What seemed like a minor act of disrespect on a flight turned into a catalyst for a global movement reshaping industries, corporate cultures, and the way people are treated. This is the story of how one CEO turned a moment of personal injustice into a revolution that would echo for generations. It's a story of courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that respect and equality should never be optional. Aidan Blackwood sat comfortably in his first-class seat, the soft hum of the airplane engines blending with the calm chatter of the passengers around him. As the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, he was accustomed to luxury and comfort, particularly when flying. His mind was focused on the presentation for the merger that was about to close the next morning in Paris. With his tablet in hand and a slight smile on his face, he ordered his usual lobster bisque, followed by filet mignon, the perfect way to relax and prepare for a busy day ahead. For Aidan, flying was a routine part of life. The smell of freshly pressed linen, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the seamless service were just part of the expected experience. This was his world. He had no reason to believe that this flight would be any different from the countless others he had taken with Airlux Airlines. But as the flight attendant approached with a gentle smile, something felt off. Her demeanor was almost too practiced, too mechanical. Aidan barely glanced up as she handed him the menu. His mind was already miles away, thinking of the upcoming business negotiations. "I've already pre-ordered," he said calmly, without looking at her, his voice carrying the assurance of someone who had done this 100 times. The attendant nodded and hurried off a little too quickly, as if she were trying to rush past something unspoken. It was subtle, but Aidan felt it. She hadn't even asked if he needed anything else, or if he was comfortable. It wasn't like the usual service, and that nagging feeling began to grow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the sense that this flight wasn't going to be as routine as it appeared. Something told him that today something would happen that would change everything. As the minutes passed, Aidan returned to his work, the quiet buzz of the aircraft around him lulling him into a sense of calm. He had dealt with high-stakes deals, intense boardroom battles, and all the challenges that came with running a global company. But this moment was different. Something about it didn't sit right. His attention was momentarily drawn to the flight attendant as she returned, but her expression had changed. It was no longer friendly but strained. She approached him with a polite smile, though there was something forced about it. "I'm sorry, sir, but we've run out of the luxury meal options. You'll have to choose from the regular selection," she said, her voice smooth but lacking sincerity. Aidan blinked in confusion, taken aback. He had pre-ordered his meal, a service Airlux prided itself on. "Out," he asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "I pre-ordered." His words were met with the same dismissive shrug. "It must not have gone through. Happens sometimes," she replied, flatly turning and walking away without offering an alternative solution, or even an apology. Aidan's jaw tightened, but his face remained an impassive mask. The absurdity of it all struck him, then his meal had been overlooked. In first class, a pre-ordered meal that had always been delivered without fail on his countless flights with Airlux. He stared at the sad sandwich and lukewarm water in front of him, mocking him in contrast to the lavish meals of the other passengers. He wasn't just frustrated by the meal, this was personal. As he glanced around, his eyes briefly met those of the other passengers. They were all men in tailored suits sipping champagne and chatting casually, oblivious to what had just transpired. They hadn't noticed the dismissal, hadn't seen how the attendant had ignored him, hadn't felt the weight of the moment. They were in their world, and Aidan was in his. He wasn't just any passenger, he was a successful CEO. Yet in that moment, he felt invisible, reduced to something less than the others around him. This wasn't just an oversight. This was a reminder that, in the eyes of some, he didn't belong in the same spaces. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just about a meal. It wasn't even about the airline. It was about the subtle but insidious way he had been treated time and time again because of his race. But Aidan wasn't the type of man to let this go unnoticed. This small moment of disrespect would become the catalyst for something far bigger. He wouldn't let it slide. And Stratus Air would soon learn that disrespect had a price. Aidan's mind was racing, but outwardly he remained calm. He didn't let the simmering anger rise to the surface. He was too accustomed to maintaining control. He could feel his pulse quicken, the injustice of the situation seeping deeper with each passing second. He had been a part of high-powered boardrooms where the stakes were always high, where the pressure to perform was constant, and where every decision counted. But this was different. It wasn't just a failed meal. It was a glaring reminder of how he, a black man, was still treated as less than. He had seen this before, the subtle prejudices that people often, without even realizing it, carried with them. It wasn't about the sandwich. It wasn't even about the flight. It was about something deeper, the quiet discrimination that still ran rampant beneath the surface. But Aidan wasn't going to lash out, wasn't going to make a scene. That wasn't his style. No, he would handle this with the same precision and strategy that he applied to his business decisions. In the quiet recesses of his mind, he began to formulate a plan that would send a message not just to the airline, but to anyone who thought that people like him could be dismissed so easily. This wasn't just about getting even. It was about making sure this kind of behavior wouldn't go unchallenged. He'd made his mark in the corporate world by being strategic, by thinking several moves ahead. This moment, this injustice was no different. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Marcus Brandt, his assistant. "Everything okay?" The message read. Aidan's fingers flew over the screen, responding quickly. His words calm but direct. "Initiate internal audit protocol. Flight 917, cabin crew. ID needed. Confirm when ready." It was done. His plan was set into motion. He wasn't just going to sit back and stew in his frustration. No, Aidan Blackwood wasn't that kind of man. He was going to take action in his own quiet, calculated way. This would be a game changer. The flight attendants had no idea what they had just triggered. As the flight continued, Aidan remained composed, his face a mask of calmness as he turned his attention back to his tablet. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Passengers were sipping their drinks, chatting with one another, and going about their usual routines. But beneath that calm exterior, Aidan's mind was working at full speed. His thoughts kept returning to the flight attendant's dismissive behavior. It wasn't just the meal. It was the indifference in her tone, the way she had brushed him off as if he were just another nameless face in the crowd. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was part of a larger pattern, one that had been ingrained in the company culture. It was a culture that overlooked people like him, dismissed their importance, and expected them to quietly accept being treated as lesser. But not Aidan. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, and built too much of his empire to let this moment slide. This wasn't the first time he had faced racism or subtle discrimination, but now, in this moment, it was personal. As the plane neared its destination in Paris, Aidan knew that this would be his final act, his quiet but powerful stand against the inequality that still permeated the air. The flight attendants continued to serve drinks, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Aidan's phone buzzed again. Marcus was ready. The internal audit was set in motion, and the names of the flight crew were already in his hands. What Aidan had already suspected was confirmed. The flight attendant who had denied him his meal had a history of complaints, rude behavior, favoritism towards certain passengers, and even passive-aggressive remarks that prioritized white passengers over others. It was systemic, and it had gone unchecked for far too long, but that would change now. As the plane descended into Paris, Aidan prepared himself for the next step. This wasn't just about one flight, one meal, or one instance of disrespect. This was about sending a message to an entire system that had become too comfortable in its discriminatory ways. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every person who had ever been overlooked or dismissed because of the color of their skin. The plane landed, and Aidan knew that the moment had arrived. His calculated decision would soon ripple through stratus air and beyond. There was no turning back now. As the wheels of the plane touched down in Paris, Aidan could feel the weight of the moment settle around him. It was as if time slowed down. The bustle of the cabin and the usual rush to disembark faded into the background as his mind focused on the task ahead. He had already set his plan into motion, but now it was time to execute it calmly and precisely. The flight attendants, oblivious to what was about to unfold, continued with their duties. They moved about the cabin, their routine actions unaware of the storm brewing in the background. Aidan stood up, gathering his things, with the same quiet confidence he always exuded. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some out of curiosity, others simply unaware of the power that sat among them. He walked down the aisle, moving with the same composed steps that had led him through boardrooms and business deals. But as he passed the flight attendants, his mind was far from the usual routine of travel. He He wasn't thinking about his upcoming meetings or the deals waiting for him in Paris. He was thinking about the message that was about to be delivered. As he reached the door of the plane, two sharply dressed airline officials were waiting for him. They didn't say a word. They simply stepped aside to allow him to pass. Knowing exactly who he was, Aidan didn't even glance at them. He walked straight past his mind already on what was happening behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Marcus back at the office had already sent the gathered evidence to the top executives at Stratus Air. He didn't need to explain it. They would understand the magnitude of the situation. Aidan had orchestrated this from the shadows, and now it was their turn to face the consequences of their inaction. The moment Aidan stepped off the plane, the game had changed. As the flight attendants began to disembark, they were met not by their usual exit procedure, but by a team of HR officers. Their carefree attitudes and casual movements would soon turn into shock and confusion. They had no idea what was coming. What they didn't know was that their actions' small, seemingly insignificant moments of disrespect had already cost them everything. Aidan wasn't going to give them a dramatic confrontation. That wasn't his style. Instead, he had chosen a far more effective approach, one that would resonate through the company and make sure that no one, regardless of their position or status, would ever overlook the importance of respect again. The flight attendants, still unaware, walked straight into their fate, completely blindsided by the consequences of their actions. They had no idea that their careers were about to unravel in front of them all, because they had failed to recognize the power that sat before them in seat 1A. As the flight attendants walked off the plane, still oblivious to the impending consequences, Aidan felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He knew that in a matter of minutes, everything they had worked for would come crashing down. They had no idea how their careless behavior had led to their downfall. For Aidan, it wasn't about revenge. It was about setting things right. It was about creating a system where discrimination wouldn't be overlooked, where everyone, regardless of their race, would be treated with dignity and respect. Aidan wasn't the kind of man to make a scene, and he didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. As he stood by the gate watching the flight attendants disappear down the corridor, his mind was already looking ahead to the aftermath. This was only the beginning. The ripple effects of this moment would echo throughout Stratus Air. They had underestimated him, thinking that because of his race, they could treat him as less than, thinking that he wouldn't have the power or the determination to fight back. But Aidan Blackwood was not someone who could be underestimated. He had built his empire on strategy, on patience, on understanding the game and playing it better than anyone else. And now the game was changing. Back in the office, Marcus worked swiftly, sending the compiled files to the highest levels of the airline's leadership. The internal audit was already underway, and the names of the crew members involved were now on the radar of HR and corporate management. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't a single incident. It wasn't a random mistake. It was part of a pattern of systemic discrimination that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The attendant who had denied Aidan his meal wasn't just acting out of negligence. She was part of a larger culture within the company that had prioritized certain passengers over others. A culture that had dismissed people of color like Aidan as unimportant, as expendable. As the internal audit dug deeper, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just one racist flight attendant. It was an entire system of unspoken bias, favoritism, and unequal treatment. And Aidan wasn't about to let that slide. He had set the stage for this moment with a calculated precision that no one at Stratus Air could have predicted. Now they would have to confront the reality of their own actions. The repercussions would be far-reaching. Meanwhile, the flight attendants, still unaware of the fate that awaited them, moved toward the exit, with the same nonchalant attitude that had gotten them into trouble in the first place. They had no idea that their careers, their livelihoods were about to be shattered. Aidan's message had already been sent. Their dismissive attitudes, their subtle racism, their unprofessional behavior, it would all come crashing down in a matter of hours. But Aidan wasn't done yet. He had one final act to play, the culmination of his strategy. As he watched them leave, his mind turned to the next step. This wasn't just about holding them accountable. This was about sending a clear message to the rest of the company and to the industry at large. No one, no matter their position, no matter their background, could treat others with disrespect and expect to get away with it. As the HR officers closed in on the flight attendants, the tension in the air was palpable. The crew had no idea what was happening, still moving through the airport with the same carefree attitude they had displayed throughout the flight. But their routine was about to be shattered. Aidan stood at a distance, watching quietly as his plan came to fruition. He had orchestrated this moment with precision, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. The flight attendants were greeted by the HR team, who wasted no time in escorting them away from the terminal. The confusion on their faces was evident. They had no idea why they were being pulled aside, no idea that their careless actions had led to their sudden downfall. The HR officers didn't explain much. They didn't need to. They just led the flight attendants away. Their careers effectively frozen in an instant. As Aidan watched, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. His decision to take action had not only exposed the flaws in the airline's service, but it also sent a powerful message to the entire company. It wasn't about revenge. It was about creating a shift in the culture, a shift that would ensure no one would ever be treated with the same level of disrespect again. Meanwhile, in the background, Marcus was working tirelessly to ensure that the full scope of the flight crew's behavior would be exposed. The internal audit was in full swing, and the evidence was mounting. The flight attendants' history of discrimination was being laid bare for the executives to see. Every biased remark, every act of favoritism was being documented. What had seemed like a simple oversight, a missed meal order, had now become the catalyst for a deeper investigation into the airline's practices. Aidan knew that Stratus Air would not be able to ignore the systemic issues that had been allowed to go unchecked for so long. And as the flight attendants were led away, their futures uncertain, Aidan knew that the first step toward a more equitable future had already been taken. The consequences of their actions would not be swift, but they would be undeniable. The chain of events set in motion by a single act of disrespect would leave a lasting impact. Stratus Air would be forced to reckon with its own culture and make the necessary changes to ensure that no one, regardless of their race or status, would ever feel the way Aidan had felt on that flight. As the minutes ticked by, Aidan felt a quiet pride in knowing that he had made a difference not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, disrespected, or dismissed. His message had been delivered loud and clear. Respect and equality were not negotiable. The airline would either change or it would pay the price. And as Aidan walked toward the terminal, he knew that no one would ever underestimate him again. As Aidan stepped into the bustling terminal, his mind was still locked on the events unfolding behind him. The flight attendants had been escorted away, their faces pale with shock. And though Aidan didn't look back, he could sense the ripples spreading. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't just a moment of personal justice for him, it was a shift in the culture of the airline. The consequences had already begun, but they would be far-reaching. Back at Stratus Air's headquarters, the internal audit was now in full swing, and what had once been a quiet, seemingly insignificant incident had now snowballed into a full-blown investigation. Aidan had known exactly what he was doing. By setting things in motion calmly and quietly, he had ensured that the scrutiny would be inevitable. The executives now faced with the glaring evidence of bias, favoritism, and discriminatory practices had no choice but to confront the reality of their company's flaws. As the minutes passed, Aidan's assistant Marcus sent him the first of many updates. The internal audit was uncovering damning details about not just the flight attendants, but the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. The crew member who had denied Aidan his pre-ordered meal was not an isolated case. Far from it. The records were showing a pattern of preferential treatment toward white passengers, a consistent disregard for passengers of color, and an environment where discrimination was tolerated even if unspoken. This wasn't just a single unfortunate incident. It was a reflection of a company-wide problem that needed to be addressed, and quickly Aidan knew that the truth had to come out. The story of his experience would be the catalyst that forced Stratus Air to take action, but it wasn't about public revenge or embarrassment. This was about creating real change, ensuring that the company could no longer operate as it had, oblivious to the consequences of its actions. The wheels of corporate reform were now in motion. Stratus Air's leadership, unable to ignore the mounting evidence, was facing pressure from all sides. They had no choice but to confront the deep-seated issues within their organization. As Aidan left the airport and made his way to his hotel, his thoughts were clear. This wasn't just about holding a few individuals accountable. This was about systemic change. This was about making sure that no one else would ever have to experience what he had, quietly being sidelined and dismissed. No one would be treated as less than anyone else. Later that evening, Aidan received a call from Stratus Air's CEO. The conversation, though polite, was filled with tension. The CEO, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, apologized for the actions of the flight attendants and promised a full review of their training and customer service protocols. But Aidan knew this was only the beginning. Words were easy. Action was what mattered. He wasn't interested in empty promises. He wanted to see real change. The following days were filled with more meetings, phone calls, and strategic discussions. Aidan wasn't just going to let the issue fade into the background. He was in it for the long haul, ensuring that Stratus Air would implement lasting reforms that would reshape its culture. The message had been delivered, and now it was time for the company to prove that it could change. Aidan had shown them that even the smallest moment of disrespect, when left unchecked, could unravel the very foundation of an organization. It had been a calculated move, but one that would echo for years to come. The power of a single individual willing to stand up against an entire system had sparked a revolution. As Aidan looked out over the Paris skyline from his hotel room, he knew the battle wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. He had made them listen, and Stratus Air would never be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and the ripples from Aidan's quiet stand began to spread far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Stratus Air, once a symbol of luxury and impeccable service, was now under intense scrutiny. Aidan had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. As news of the internal audit and the firing of the flight attendants leaked, it didn't take long for the public to catch wind of the story. Social media, always quick to amplify injustice, erupted. Hashtags like Ujarm Respect Matters and Ionia Equality in the air were trending worldwide, and people began to question the practices of airlines, corporations, and businesses in general. The media picked up the story, but unlike the usual sensational headlines, this one was different. It wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. Stratus Air's leadership knew they couldn't sweep this under the rug. Public pressure mounted and internal discussions at the highest levels grew heated. The CEO of Stratus Air, while apologetic in private, had to face an uncomfortable reality. Their company was being exposed for its deeply ingrained biases, and something had to be done. Meanwhile, Aidan watched from a distance, knowing that the true battle was just beginning. He had made them listen, but now it was time for them to act. The question was whether they would do more than issue statements and perform token gestures. Would they embrace the kind of systemic change necessary to root out the biases that had become part of their corporate culture, or would they return to business as usual, hoping the storm would pass? Marcus kept him updated with every development, every meeting that took place in Stratus Air's boardrooms. The pressure was mounting, but Aidan knew that true reform would require more than just firing a few employees. He had already seen the deep flaws in their structure, and he wasn't about to let them get away with a superficial fix. The next step in his strategy was critical. He reached out to the airline's HR department, insisting that they begin retraining programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just for the flight attendants, but for everyone involved in customer service. It wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about ensuring that every employee, every passenger was treated with respect, regardless of their race, gender, or background. But it wasn't easy. Some within the company were resistant to change. They had spent years building a reputation for luxury. And now that reputation was being questioned, Aidan's request wasn't just about firing a few individuals. It was about challenging the very foundation of the company's approach to service. It was a cultural shift, and some of the older executives weren't ready to embrace it. They had lived in a world where such issues were ignored, where the status quo was accepted without question. But Aidan was relentless. Every email, every phone call, every meeting was focused on one thing: creating a legacy of respect that would last. As Aidan moved through these negotiations, his resolve only strengthened. He had seen how systemic problems could be perpetuated through inaction. He had felt the sting of discrimination, subtle but painful, that day on the plane. He wasn't going to let this go until every part of Stratus Air had been reshaped, until every passenger felt valued and respected. Not just the ones in first class. It wasn't about changing one meal order. It was about changing the way the entire industry saw people like him. And though the journey was far from over, Aidan knew that his quiet act of defiance had already sparked a movement. The storm he had unleashed was not going to fade away. It was only getting stronger. Weeks passed and Stratus Air's internal restructuring efforts began to take shape. What had once been a single moment of disrespect, a small oversight in the grand scheme of things, had now evolved into a much larger conversation about race equity and justice within the corporate world. Aidan continued to be at the center of it all, not out of desire for recognition, but because he understood that this wasn't just about one company. It was about setting a precedent for the entire industry. Stratus Air's leadership had no choice but to confront the larger issues they had long ignored. The board had been forced into an uncomfortable position: either embrace the sweeping changes Aidan demanded, or face public disgrace and the loss of their standing in the competitive airline industry. What followed was a carefully crafted series of moves aimed at rebuilding the company's reputation and implementing the kind of deep cultural changes Aidan had pushed for. The company began rolling out company-wide diversity and inclusion training, focusing not just on surface-level understanding, but on real impactful shifts in how employees treated each other, and more importantly, how they treated their customers. From top executives to the newest hires, no one was exempt from the training. For the first time in Stratus Air's history, the company recognized that luxury was not just about amenities. It was about respect. Aidan had no intentions of sitting back and letting the airline simply do the bare minimum. He kept the pressure on, insisting on accountability at every level. He wasn't looking for superficial apologies or empty promises. He demanded transparency in every part of the process, and it wasn't easy. There were those who resisted, who saw his actions as a threat to their long-established ways of doing business. But Aidan didn't care about their discomfort. What mattered was that the culture at Stratus Air and the entire industry was changing. Slowly, but surely, the company's leadership began to realize that the changes were not just necessary. They were inevitable. Customers began to take notice as well. Social media buzzed with support for Aidan's actions, and many travelers began to express their appreciation for the new direction the airline was taking. Stratus Air had gone from being a symbol of elitism and exclusivity to a company fighting for equality and respect for all its passengers. It wasn't perfect, and Aidan knew the journey was far from over. But he had made his point. The corporate world had to evolve. In those quiet, unspoken moments when Aidan had been dismissed as just another black man in a first-class seat, he had realized the depth of the problem. But now, with the foundation of Stratus Air shaking beneath the weight of the changes he had forced, Aidan knew that his fight had made a real, lasting impact. The consequences were clear. No one, regardless of race background or social status, would ever be overlooked again. The transformation had begun, not just for Stratus Air, but for every company that would follow in its wake. It was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about making sure that no one was ever made to feel invisible again. And though Aidan was just one man in that moment, he felt a quiet sense of pride, knowing that he had sparked a change that would ripple through the industry for years to come. As Stratus Air's restructuring took shape, the ripple effects spread far beyond the company itself. Aidan's quiet act of defiance had ignited something much larger, a conversation about fairness and equality that the airline industry had long avoided. Other airlines, once eager to brush off any suggestions of discrimination as baseless complaints, were now beginning to reassess their own practices. What had started as a personal battle for respect had morphed into a movement that was forcing corporations to take a long, hard look at themselves. The spotlight that Aidan had cast on Stratus Air's flaws was now shining on the industry as a whole. Media outlets, from major news organizations to smaller independent blogs, were running stories on corporate discrimination, the luxury travel industry's exclusivity, and the subtle prejudices that still lingered in business practices. Analysts began questioning the luxury that companies like Stratus Air so proudly marketed, while failing to acknowledge the unequal treatment of their diverse clientele. Aidan had, without even realizing it, become the face of a new era in corporate responsibility. His story, while deeply personal, had turned into a catalyst for change, a moment that had forced an entire industry to confront its biases. In the weeks that followed, Aidan's name became synonymous with accountability. He was invited to speak at conferences, business forums, and on panels discussing the importance of diversity and inclusion in the corporate world. His story was not just about what happened on that flight. It was about standing up against a system that had long allowed discrimination to fester in the shadows. Aidan wasn't interested in personal glory. He had always been a private person, more focused on building his business than seeking the limelight. But now he saw the larger purpose in sharing his experience. It wasn't about him, it was about shifting the corporate narrative to one of fairness and equal treatment for everyone, regardless of their race or background. At Stratus Air, the changes were beginning to take root. They began implementing more visible efforts to diversify their leadership, with the hiring of more people of color and women in executive roles. They launched customer service initiatives focused on empathy and respect, ensuring that all passengers, regardless of their appearance, felt valued. But Aidan knew this was just the beginning. The airline industry was vast, and the changes they were implementing needed to be mirrored across every facet of corporate culture, not just in one company. He began reaching out to others in the business world, offering guidance and support for those looking to tackle similar issues within their organizations. Aidan's next move was to open a dialogue with leaders from various industries, pushing them to reconsider their hiring practices, the way they marketed themselves, and how they treated their employees and customers. He wanted to see change in every sector, from hospitality to technology, from retail to finance. And slowly but surely, companies began to listen. Some leaders, like those at Stratus Air, realized the necessity of reform. Others, however, resisted the notion of a deep cultural overhaul, preferring to stick to their outdated ways. But Aidan had learned long ago that real change, often comes from the pressure of a few who refuse to back down. The conversations Aidan was starting, while difficult, were necessary. As businesses began to implement diversity programs, conduct sensitivity training, and rethink their approach to customer service, Aidan knew that the world was starting to shift. And even if that change took time, it would be lasting. The lessons learned from that one flight, from the small but impactful moment when Aidan was denied a simple meal, would have a ripple effect that would be felt for generations. As he continued his work, Aidan remained steadfast in his belief that no one should ever be made to feel invisible again. The quiet revolution had begun, and the corporate world would never be the same. Aidan had made them see that respect was not a privilege, it was a right. And he was just getting started. Months passed, and the impact of Aidan's actions continued to resonate throughout Stratus Air and the broader industry. What had started as a personal moment of injustice had snowballed into a wave of corporate introspection and transformation. Stratus Air, once the symbol of luxury and exclusivity, had become a leading example of how a company could evolve, acknowledge its flaws, make amends, and set a new standard for how it treated its customers and employees. The new training programs were proving successful, with flight attendants and employees being held accountable not just for their performance, but also for their behavior and attitudes. Aidan had made sure of that his insistence on tracking progress, ensuring that training wasn't just a checkbox, but a deep cultural shift, pushed the company to stay on course. But the changes went beyond just one airline. As Aidan had hoped, other businesses were following suit, implementing similar diversity and inclusion initiatives. Across the globe, conversations about corporate accountability were taking place where there had once been silence. His story was becoming a case study in business schools, a lesson on how a single act of courage could challenge the status quo and inspire industry-wide change. Even in industries unrelated to airlines, businesses were beginning to take note of the shift in consumer expectations. Customers were no longer willing to tolerate a lack of respect in exchange for luxury. They demanded more, and with the success of his campaign, Aidan had proven that even the smallest act could snowball into a movement. Though the attention he received was significant, Aidan never sought the spotlight. He declined offers to write books, turn his story into a documentary, or speak on endless panels. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. He was a businessman, not a crusader. Yet in the quiet moments when he reflected on how far things had come, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment, not because of the attention or the accolades, but because he had seen firsthand how power and privilege can be wielded to challenge long-standing inequality. It wasn't easy, and the battle wasn't over, but Aidan knew he had made a lasting impact. For Aidan, it had never been about revenge or even redemption. It was about reshaping the narrative. It was about ensuring that people like him, people of color, people who had been overlooked, people who had been conditioned to accept second-class treatment, would no longer feel invisible. The corporate world, once so deeply entrenched in its old ways, had been shaken by a simple, quiet act of defiance. As Stratus Air and other companies continued to move forward with their diversity initiatives, Aidan's influence remained a guiding force. But the most important part of the change wasn't the policies, the new hires, or the training programs. It was the mindset shift that had occurred. People no longer saw racial or cultural differences as something to be ignored or downplayed. Instead, there was a new recognition that diversity was an asset, not a liability. Respect wasn't a luxury reserved for a select few. It was a fundamental right for everyone. Aidan knew this battle was ongoing, that true systemic change would take time. But as he sat in his office one afternoon, watching the sunset from his window, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had fought for respect, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been wronged, overlooked, or underestimated. He had set in motion a wave of change that would continue to reverberate for years. And in that moment, Aidan Blackwood realized that he had not only changed the airline industry, he had changed the way the world viewed the power of respect equality and what it meant to stand up for what was right. The future, though, still uncertain, was brighter, and Aidan knew that the change he had fought for, the legacy he had begun, would inspire others to continue the fight, ensuring that no one would ever again be made to feel invisible in the face of injustice. As the months wore on, Aidan's quiet influence spread further into the business world. His name had become synonymous with corporate accountability, but he knew the real work was far from over. Stratus Air's internal changes, though monumental, were just the beginning of a much wider transformation that needed to happen across industries. Aidan had learned something crucial. Real change in corporate culture required sustained effort, ongoing pressure, and most importantly, leadership willing to embrace uncomfortable truths. And that was exactly what he had brought to the table, a willingness to face down uncomfortable realities and force those in power to address them. Head on, Aidan was approached by various organizations, seeking his expertise, asking how they could implement similar initiatives in their own companies. He had the choice to become a consultant, to take his knowledge and turn it into a career, but that wasn't his path. Instead, Aidan chose to focus on the one thing that mattered most: his company. He knew that if he truly wanted to create lasting change, he needed to start at home at his own business. And so, while the world outside was slowly adapting, Aidan focused on ensuring that his company maintained the highest standards of inclusivity, transparency, and respect. His company's HR policies were updated, incorporating the lessons learned from his fight with Stratus. Air diversity training was now mandatory for everyone, from the entry-level employees to the executive board. There were no exceptions. Aidan knew that companies couldn't just put diversity programs in place to check a box. They had to live and breathe those principles at every level. But Aidan didn't just talk the talk. He made sure that the leaders within his organization were held accountable not just for their performance, but for how they treated their colleagues and clients. If anything was amiss, if any behavior didn't align with the company's values, the issue was addressed swiftly without hesitation. Though Aidan's company had already been a success, the cultural shift was tangible. Employees felt heard, valued, and respected. They knew that Aidan's commitment to diversity wasn't just lip service. It was a driving force behind every decision made. This culture of accountability and respect became a model for others to follow. It was clear Aidan's legacy wasn't just about his personal journey or his corporate success. It was about the shift he had ignited in the corporate world, a shift toward real, lasting change that would endure for generations to come. Aidan's influence in the corporate world had changed the way business leaders thought about race and equality. He had given them a framework for how to deal with discrimination, how to make meaningful changes, and how to build a corporate culture where everyone had an equal chance to thrive. And as companies across various industries began to adopt similar practices, Aidan could see the world changing before his eyes. It wasn't perfect. It would take years to fully eradicate deep-seated biases. But Aidan had given people a blueprint for how to begin, and that was more than most could say. In the quieter moments, Aidan would reflect on everything that had transpired, the flight that had set everything in motion, the challenges he had faced, the people he had met along the way. He hadn't just fought for his own dignity. He had fought for something much greater. He had fought for the right of every person, regardless of race, to be seen, heard, and respected. It wasn't an easy battle, and it wasn't over yet. But Aidan knew one thing for certain: the world had changed, and he had played a part in that transformation. The world would never be the same. And in the long run, that was the most satisfying part of all. As time passed, Aidan's influence continued to reshape the business landscape. His commitment to fairness and equity was not just a personal crusade, but a broader movement that was slowly but surely embedding itself into the foundations of corporate culture worldwide. His story, once just about a meal order on a plane, had grown into a paradigm shift, one that was forcing companies to rethink everything they knew about leadership, inclusivity, and respect. Aidan had not only shifted the narrative for Stratus Air, But his actions had also sparked a fire in other business leaders, executives, and corporations to do the same. No longer could a company hide behind the guise of luxury service without addressing its internal biases and systemic inequality. Aidan's example proved that true luxury was not about the prestige of the brand or the elegance of a meal. It was about treating people with dignity and respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. As more companies from tech giants to small startups began to adopt diversity and inclusion programs, Aidan's message was clear. This was not just a trend. This was a new era of corporate responsibility. In boardrooms around the world, discussions about equality were no longer an afterthought. Leaders now understood that their success didn't just depend on profits. It depended on the kind of culture they fostered within their walls. In a few short years, Aidan had catalyzed an evolution in how business leaders viewed their roles in society. It wasn't just about financial success. It was about the responsibility to drive change, to lead with integrity, and to create environments where every person felt empowered, respected, and valued. But Aidan wasn't done. Though he had succeeded in shifting the corporate world's perspective, he knew that true change would take time and the path ahead was long. He continued to push the boundaries, advocating for legislation that would enforce corporate transparency on diversity and inclusion initiatives. He worked closely with nonprofit organizations, mentorship programs, and educational institutions, ensuring that the next generation of leaders would grow up with a mindset rooted in fairness and equality. He began funding scholarships and internships aimed at breaking the glass ceiling for marginalized communities, determined to ensure that opportunities would be accessible to all, regardless of their background. Aidan's vision wasn't one of division. It was one of unity. He believed that businesses could grow and prosper while still maintaining core values of fairness and inclusivity. To him, those values weren't just moral imperatives. They were strategic advantages that could drive innovation and growth. The companies that embraced this mindset would thrive, while those that resisted it would eventually be left behind. His dedication to change didn't go unnoticed. Major organizations began to seek him out for advice, and even governmental bodies took his insights into account as they began crafting policies aimed at combating workplace discrimination. His work was not limited to the private sector. Alone, he had set the stage for a broader societal shift, one where equality wasn't just an aspiration, but a standard to be upheld at every level of business. Even as the public eye moved on, Aidan remained deeply involved in ensuring the initiatives he had started would continue to evolve. He mentored young entrepreneurs, particularly those from underrepresented communities, helping them navigate the business world and become leaders in their own right. He knew that true transformation wouldn't happen until these principles were fully ingrained in the next generation of leaders. And as the world began to change, Aidan looked back on the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy, and there were many moments when he had been tempted to walk away from the fight. But in the end, he had stuck to his values and proven that even in the face of seemingly small slights, real change could happen when one person stood up and refused to be ignored. His legacy would not just be measured in the success of his business ventures or the changes he had brought to Stratus Air. It would be measured in the countless people whose lives had been made better by the corporate world, finally learning how to respect them. And as Aidan continued his work, he knew one thing. The journey wasn't over yet, but it was a journey worth fighting for. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a meal. It was about making sure that everyone everywhere could sit at the table and be treated with the dignity they deserved. Years passed, but the legacy of Aidan Blackwood's actions continued to shape the corporate world in ways that no one could have imagined at the beginning. The changes he had sparked within Stratus Air spread across industries like wildfire, each company trying to catch up to the new standards of inclusion and respect that had become the norm. The ripple effect was undeniable. What had started with a single moment of disrespect on a plane had become a global movement, a movement rooted in the simple yet powerful idea that every person, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Stratus Air, once notorious for its exclusivity, had become a leader in diversity and inclusion, setting the tone for the entire airline industry. Their commitment to reform wasn't just about PR. It was embedded in every layer of their operations, from customer service to executive leadership. Aidan had made them see that true luxury wasn't about an image of perfection. It was about creating an environment where everyone felt welcome, respected, and valued. But it wasn't just Stratus Air. Across every industry, companies were transforming. Corporate leaders no longer saw diversity as a checkbox, something to be done out of obligation. They saw it as a key ingredient to their success. Businesses were finding that diversity brought innovation, creativity, and resilience. They were realizing that inclusivity was not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. The economy, once driven by the narrow interests of a few, was now slowly but surely becoming more inclusive, more diverse, and more representative of the global society we lived in. And at the heart of that change was Aidan Blackwood, whose actions had paved the way for a new era in corporate culture. Yet, despite the monumental shift he had helped create, Aidan never stopped pushing for more. He knew that the fight for equality was ongoing, and that there was still much work to be done. He continued to use his platform, his wealth, and his influence to ensure that companies everywhere were held accountable for their treatment of people from all walks of life. His foundation, which he had created to support young people from underrepresented communities, became one of the largest of its kind, providing scholarships, mentorship, and career opportunities to countless individuals who had once been overlooked. Aidan's name was now synonymous with accountability, justice, and progress. But it wasn't about the title or the recognition. What mattered most to Aidan was the lasting change he had helped create. As he walked into boardrooms to meet with other business leaders, his mind wasn't on the money or the accolades. It was on the next big fight, the next frontier for progress. And the next fight wasn't going to be easy. There were still companies resisting change, still people who saw diversity as a threat rather than an opportunity. But Aidan had never backed down from a challenge. He knew that it was the people who dared to stand up, who refused to accept the status quo, who would change the world. As he looked back on the years of hard work, struggles, and triumphs, Aidan smiled, knowing that he had done more than just change an airline or a corporate culture. He had changed the world, one act of courage at a time, and in the end, that was his greatest legacy. The world was a little fairer, a little more just, and a lot more respectful because of him. Aidan Blackwood's journey proves that change doesn't always come from loud protests or public outcries. It often starts with quiet defiance, a refusal to accept the way things are. His actions didn't just transform an airline, they transformed an entire industry, and his legacy continues to inspire leaders around the world. But the fight isn't over. The work for equality, respect, and true corporate responsibility is ongoing. As Aidan's story shows, even one individual can make a lasting difference, and sometimes it's the quietest moments that create the loudest echoes of change. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and let us continue this journey toward a more just and inclusive world together.